All right, well, welcome everybody. We are so pleased that you're here for our Fair Districts Fair Democracy Huddle. Um, Folks are dropping their names and their locations in the chat, which is exciting to see the distribution all across the state. Today, we are going to talk about primaries, everything about primaries. Why do we have them? What are the challenges? What do voters need to know? And how you can talk about primaries to to encourage voters to participate and why it's so important. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth from the League, who's going to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending what I hope is a beautiful evening where you are as well with us. Um, and I'm so happy to see you at the end of day two of Ohio's primary. I feel like we have been living and breathing all things primary elections for the last few months, so it's genuinely exciting that people are actually voting in real life. I'm Elizabeth Warner. I'm the communications director with the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and we're just going to launch right into some basics. So first, what are primaries? Primaries, we'll also call them primary elections, are elections that are held to determine which candidates qualify to run for office in the general election. Most primaries are partisan, so candidates from the same party run against each other to win their party's nomination for the general election. Um, Lots of elected offices are nonpartisan too, especially at the local level. Judges, school board, often city council races. Issues can also be part of a primary. I live in Columbus. We have a big one on our ballot right now. Many of you do too. If you want to share any of those, we'd love to see that as well. Why do primaries matter? Primaries matter because they determine the choices that voters have when they go into the general election. And they matter because the primaries shape the issues that candidates prioritize before the general election even gets going. And who can vote in Ohio's primaries? This is one of the most important things that we're going to talk about tonight because I think it is both the biggest source of misinformation and maybe the biggest question that we at the league get. And we will go into this more deeply later in our presentation. But for now, just know every eligible voter can vote in a primary. Any voter can vote for candidates in a primary. But in Ohio, we have to choose candidates from one party only to vote on. And we can go to the next slide. So, because states are in charge of their own elections, each of us has primaries that are a little bit different. Most of us do fall somewhere along the open to closed spectrum. With open primaries, voters choose candidates from parties that they want to vote for. So this is a private choice. It doesn't count as registering with a party. In some states, ballots have all the candidates running just like they would in a general election, so voters can cross party lines. The procedure is kind of the same as it would be in a general election for a voter. And so this means that a voter could vote for a Democrat in one race and a Republican in another race, a Libertarian or whatever candidate happened to qualify for the ballot in where they were. Um, a semi-open primary is where voters can choose any party's ballot, but they are limited to ballot choice by one party, and that ballot choice may be regarded as a form of party registration. Semi-closed primaries allow political parties to choose whether unaffiliated voters can participate before each election cycle, and parties might allow unaffiliated voters while at the same time excluding members of opposing parties. And then in a closed primary, voters have to be a registered party member before an election. So if you lived in a closed primary state and like almost half of Americans now identified as independent, that would be it. There would be no primary voting for you. Unaffiliated voters now represent the largest group of voters, and in states like Florida and New Jersey, they are totally shut out of the primary process. There is some legislation in the Ohio House that would like to make us like New Jersey, which I don't feel like that would be a good fit for us. Mia is going to talk about that in a little bit. Who knows which kind of state that we are? You can put that in the chat while we go on. Because I think there's always a little confusion about it, but I will say, so we are a semi-open state. So we can be registered with one party and vote for candidates on another party's ballot or not have any affiliation at all and still get to choose any party's ballot to vote on. And we'll talk more about what registering with a party means in a minute. Although, spoiler, it's kind of meaningless. But the main thing is that here in Ohio, we are limited to voting on candidates from just one party. And we can go to the next slide, which you've already done. So there is another kind of primary that is used in just a few states. It's the nonpartisan primary. This is also sometimes called the jungle primary. Some people call it the top two or the top four primary. And these primaries feel to the voter like a general election. So they vote using the same ballot, regardless of party affiliation. Candidates do retain their party ID on the ballot. And then the top two or four, depending on the state's rules, the top two or four vote getters, the candidates with the most votes, go on to the general election. There are just a few states that do this. California sort of dramatically at the moment, and Alaska most recently, and then Washington State. Louisiana used to, but as of this year, they are a closed primary state. So a thing to watch on their election night is just how that goes and whether people are going to be happy with it. I'm guessing not so much, but we will see. And this leads us to tonight's guest. So Ohio Senator Blessing, who is here to talk to us about two bills that he has introduced into the Ohio General Assembly that would change how we do primaries in Ohio. So with that, Senator, we are delighted to have you and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you guys for having me here. I could think of, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago that might not have been the case, but from where I can see, how things are operating in Ohio and the country more generally, frankly, a lot of what you guys have been pushing for is becoming more apparent why it's correct. And frankly, this, idea of your top two primary, which is Senate Bill 382, or the top three consensus voting, which is Senate Bill 395, why things like this are more important. But Elizabeth nailed it with respect to Senate Bill 382 and just the simple trying to do a California style top two primary in Ohio is, quite frankly, if you just look at the Secretary of State's website and see voter registration, independents vastly outnumber Republicans and Democrats combined. And, that's somebody's choice. That's fine. The problem is a smaller and smaller subset of Ohio's population is choosing ultimately who our elected officials are. And so the net effect of this is that it's been playing to the extremes where you have people who are like, look, if the most rabid members of the base of either side of the aisle are the ones that are turning out and they're the only ones that can vote in that primary, well, that's who I'm going to listen to, because if I can make it through the primary, I can make it through, in most cases, the general. So, this sort of reform would, the kind of the language that I use around it with Senate Bill 382 is that it would have this gravitational pull to the center, in the sense that now if you're in a top two primary, you can't just count on your party's base to heave you over the finish line. You need to get out there and appeal to independents and frankly opposing political parties as well, in order to make it to the general. And that is a great thing in the grand scheme of things. But an even more insidious aspect of this, looking back in history, is that, in the 19th century, and, I do enjoy some of those shows that they, talk about politicians from that era. The most recent was Death by Lightning, talking about President James Garfield. But back then, primaries were closed. You had the party bosses choosing the candidates, and a famous scene in that Death by Lightning, the corrupt Senator Roscoe Conklin, just kind of found somebody standing off to the side and said, "Hey, you want to be a U.S. senator? You're okay. You're a U.S. senator." And that's horrifying to think that that's the way it was until the progressive era, when it changed to voting in the primaries. And, from my perspective, the issue of money in politics, now more than ever, I shouldn't say now more than ever. I mean, we're kind of reliving Gilded Age, progressive era politics, but in a primary where only small subsets of the population are voting, now, the big money folks can just pound them over and over and over again with mailers to again heave their preferred person across the finish line. And that's just incredibly unfortunate that that's kind of the direction we're going. But I do think that that top two primary system would be one aspect of reform that would sort of mitigate that. And more importantly, I think it's one of those things that's very simple to understand for the General Assembly. And also, there are Republicans in the House who are amenable to this. They see the problem with the primaries where, somebody gets in there and promises the world to an extreme base and can win. And, it also affects my colleagues who have said, I've heard it on a number of occasions. Well, I like that idea. I can't vote for it because then I'd get a primary. And that's not where we should be for a whole host of reasons. But that said, the other one is Senate Bill 395, which was brought to me by a bipartisan duo of former legislators. One was former Representative Gene Krebs, and the other was former Representative Sean Logan, a Republican and a Democrat. And like my Southwestern Ohio counterpart, Representative Gene Krebs, I had the same reaction, like, oh my God, this is going to solve a lot of problems. It's immediately apparent why it's valuable. But in this case, instead of a top two primary, it's a top three primary. So that way there could be, third parties, independents, whomever, just your top three make it on into the general. And then you have what is called consensus voting. And this doesn't suffer from some of the problems that ranked choice voting suffers from, although I would definitely be the first to say that ranked choice voting is better than the status quo today. But why consensus voting is valuable is that let's say you have three candidates, A, B, and C. What you would see on the ballot is A versus B, A versus C, and B versus C. And so if any candidate wins their two head-to-head matchups, they win. If each candidate only wins one, then the candidate whose losing vote total was the least bad, so the one that almost won their losing race, would be the winner. And if somehow there were a tie after all of that, that's when it goes to the Secretary of State to break ties. But from my perspective, voting machines don't really have to go have large updates to make this sort of change. You could see the results in real time. There's no rounds and rounds of voting. And three is kind of a magic number here in that it doesn't grow out of control the way it would be if you did, a top five. Then you might have 10 head-to-head matches. But here's the thing. We deal with this, and people have dealt with this all the time with respect to, NCAA tournament voting. It's the same way. It's, head-to-head matchups versus all these teams, but it's way more complex than what we're proposing here. And so anybody to say that consensus voting would be, confusing and people wouldn't understand it are just being patently disingenuous with this. Because if you can understand the NCAA bracketing system, you can understand this. But that said, I am watching some of these, chat messages pop up here. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out campaign finance. And you're 100% correct on this. Ever since Citizens United, it has been an absolute mess. But it seems like it goes back further than that, back to Buckley Vallejo. And for what it's worth, that is something that we need to address. I don't know how I would do it as a state legislator, but I'm willing to try. Because I have also heard it from candidates on both sides of the aisle that they run in primaries, particularly for Congress, and they wind up losing to a candidate with deep, deep personal wealth. And I have had one colleague who's extremely to the right, would say he's the most conservative person in Ohio, say that we are now living in an oligarchy because the only people that can afford to get to Congress are people with net worths of $10 million plus. And that's not right for, again, a whole host of obvious reasons. So I just wanted to throw that in there. So if folks want to work on campaign finance at the same time, I'm all ears. But yes, Buckley Vallejo seems to have been the start of this. And I think it was Justice, I might butcher this, Byron White, who was the dissenting vote on that, who did say, he's like, look, this is going to run out of, or going to run into problems. And
Hmm.
admittedly, back in the 70s, that was a different time, but today definitely need to do the reform. But anyway, I think I've gone past my 10 minutes, and can't thank you enough for having me here.
Catherine, did you have a question?
So I was going to say, we're just really glad that you're here. I guess one of the questions that I've heard people say is, why give two different proposals, and which ones do you think, is there one that you think has more traction with people? And basically, how do you envision having a hearing, for example, this year? What are you envisioning will happen?
So, yes, I'm guaranteed a hearing on both of them because I got them in before the April 1 deadline, which there's some nuance to that April 1 deadline. It's not quite that way, but I will get at least a hearing on both of them. I think that the top two primary, just because it's so much easier for legislators to grasp, has a better chance. But in both cases, and again, seeing some of the chats fly by, I can understand where people would be cynical, skeptical, wouldn't believe that that the General Assembly would go for this. And that's, I mean, certainly valid. And I'm at a point where for either bill, if these wanted to be, if there was a way to get these on the ballot after General Assembly inaction, I'm more than happy to be the face, a face in taking these to the ballot. The same way that I would for SJR 2 that I introduced last General Assembly because I really believe in these reforms. The thing is, though, in the meantime, yes, they're two somewhat competing proposals, but the alternative is I just try to negotiate against myself and not do anything, and I just don't feel like we're in a position where we can just do nothing. Having these things out there is better than nothing. And frankly, admittedly, I would like Senate Bill 395, if I had to choose between the two. But if I had to settle for Senate Bill 382, my God, that would be well worth it. But
Okay,
in all cases, I don't want to, we got to have stuff out there for people to see.
that's great.
Well, and I noticed there was a question about Buckley versus Vallejo, and since I'm going to quickly answer, and you jump in if there's something I don't cover. This is the case, 1976, where the court essentially said that money is not speech, but it's like a gas that makes a car go. So that, in fact, at the end of the day, you can't rein in spending by a candidate. You can put contribution limits, and that's constitutional because you're reducing corruption. But if a candidate can't spend money, you're actually getting in the way of their ability to promote themselves, help voters get to know them. Is that a good overview of Buckley v. Vallejo?
I think so. And I think the big concern was in the aftermath of that, what do you do about somebody who, has millions and millions of dollars to their name? The net effect is they have a megaphone that is so loud that it drowns out everybody else. How is that fair? Despite it
Right.
being their own money. And that seems to be the root, like the start of all of this before, we got to Citizens United, and I think the other one was McCutcheon something or other. It's hard to remember all that, but no, I think that's right.
Thank you so much for joining us. I think we may need a whole other conversation just about these bills and maybe some of your other ideas about improving democracy, because I know you have ones about districts, size of districts, and other things, and that would be really interesting. Yes, and one about money in politics. Um, but thank you so much, and we're going to zoom on to the next slide if that's okay with you. So
Thank you.
thank you,
Well, and
Elizabeth.
the next slide is about why we have primaries, and I have to say that the senator sort of stole my thunder on this, so we can kind of go quickly here. So
Okay.
we can just skip it all together because
All
that we
right.
pretty much covered it. So we can go right into here we are. Turns out primaries are kind of challenging. So 100 years later, and we kind of have to ask, are we better off with primaries than we were before? And the answer is absolutely yes. More choices, more better, right? Like it's better to have for voters to have more choices. At the same time, there are challenges that stand out in primaries that kind of magnify the problems that we see in elections in general. So the three challenges that we're going to focus on are low turnout, high partisanship, and fewer competitive elections. And we see these same problems in general elections. The first two problems, especially low turnout and high partisanship, they're problems for democracy writ large, not just elections. But in primaries, it's worse. So I think problems in primaries are like democracy's canaries in a coal mine. So let's talk about why. And from there, let's go to the numbers with Mia.
All right. Um, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of info here on who votes in primaries and a little bit of statistics. Just moving some blocks around on my screen so that I can actually see the screen. Ah, sorry. Uh, I clicked on the wrong thing.
Technology is always a
There we
challenge,
go.
isn't it?
There we go. Okay, so we don't have wonderful turnout in general in Ohio. So about 47% of registered voters voted in the November 2022 midterm election, but it's worse than half of that for primaries. So we have, roughly 21% of folks vote in primaries. What that means is that anyone who votes in a primary has more than twice the power of folks that are voting in the general. And then I found a website today that had some information about the whole US. So this is not Ohio specific, but this is just about primary voters in general. And it is really pretty interesting. And I put a link here. I think probably that's included in the links document that Catherine has been dropping into the chat. So you'll be able to look at this later. But basically, if you look at this circle at the bottom right, there's 80% of people who didn't vote in the primary at all. And then 13% of the total voted in primaries that were non-decisive, so that basically the outcome was already set. Only seven, because basically what they were saying is only about 45 uh only about 45 of 443 congressional seats are really toss-ups. A lot of them are, it's a very red district or a very blue district, and the person on the ballot from that party is going to win. So there aren't actually that many competitive congressional seats in the US. So of those small number of competitive seats, and the small number of voters who actually vote in primaries, only 7% of voters end up voting in elections where they're sorry, 7% of voters are choosing 87% of the seats of who's going to sit in those congressional seats. And those 7% of voters are not representative of the whole voting population. So, for example, 39% of the voting age population identify as independent, but only 11% of decisive primary voters call themselves independents. 47% of the voting age population consider themselves moderates, but only 11% of decisive primary voters consider themselves moderate. And then the extremes are instead of being fewer extremes, there are more extremes. So 20% of the voting population consider themselves liberals, 29% of decisive primary voters consider themselves liberals. This one is sort of shocking. 33% of the voting age population considers themselves conservatives. 60% of decisive primary voters consider themselves conservatives. And decisive primary voters are also demographically unrepresentative. They're older, whiter, wealthier, and more educated. And you can see that here. So these colored bars on the left-hand side are age groups. You can see in the general population that the oldest age group is a smaller green section, but in the primary voters, it's much bigger. And conversely, the youngest voters are a smallish percentage of the whole voting population, but a tiny percentage of the primary electorate. And then again, voting age population, much higher, older. And then if you look at the white, black, Hispanic, Asian, the white voters, there are far more of them who vote in a primary. So the primary is being decided these, so many congressional seats are decided by primaries, and they're decided by an unrepresentative group of people who vote in the primary. So, and this is similar information. It's Ohio specific. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's a little bit complicated, but the column on the left is information about the lowest turnout primaries in 2022 and 2024. So turnout was literally 0.23% in 2022 in the lowest turnout primaries, but it was 56% in the highest turnout primaries. So such a huge difference between the lowest and the highest. So there's certain precincts that are just making more of these decisions, and they are richer, older, and whiter than the precincts where fewer people are turning out. And I will let you look at that. So why is it that folks are not voting in primaries? And there are many reasons, but we can look at a lack of civic knowledge. They maybe don't know what primaries are. They don't know that they're allowed to vote in them, and they don't know that they are incredibly important. So I think that they're less likely to vote in a primary because they don't get information about it, and they don't know about the options that they have. They don't know that you can pull an issues only ballot or a Democratic or Republican ballot. They think perhaps their vote doesn't matter because they think maybe it's just something where the parties are picking the person to run, and they don't know that they can weigh in on that. And they may not even know that they're eligible. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Catherine.
So I think we can go through this pretty quickly. I think we are
Sorry.
all aware. We spent time and energy addressing gerrymandering, and we're pretty well aware that what can happen. And Mia, the slides are no
I
longer
know.
showing.
I'm trying to see. I was trying to mute it, but it didn't work. So go
Not
ahead.
to worry.
Yeah.
So meanwhile, back at the ranch, I was going to say, we, who've worked on fighting gerrymandering are very aware that what happens is if you know that you're going to win in the general election, you're going to foster, folks that are more extreme, extreme in the primary because you're like, we need to be ideologically pure, and we need to really highlight, our party rather than thinking about kind of big picture or more about the general election. And this creates a lot of different problems, including people just choosing to stay home. And then, Mia, if you'll move to the next slide. I also think, one of the things that we've gotten really used to thinking about the world is chocolate or vanilla, Democrat or Republican, us versus them. And the party labels, fuel a kind of tribalism that is not healthy. And so thinking about all the different ways that we could actually change the primary or change the way that we do voting is a good way to think about, well, how can we stir things up and actually get at some of the problems that we're all facing? And then Mia, next slide. I did want to highlight this. One of the things that I've always thought was astonishing, especially when you think about how much money is spent in congressional races, there are very few that are considered genuinely competitive. Now, these are the numbers from the Cook's report, and I think that's important to know because essentially the Cook's report identified two races in Ohio. So this is for this year that are going to be more competitive. And when you start to think about the fact, who are they? So it's Marcy Kaptur, who was drawn into a more Republican district that has really good name recognition, and then Greg's Landsman, so that's that congressional district one. What is interesting is if you go and you look at like Larry Sabato's crystal ball, he only has one toss-up district. So that yes, the political scientists, even when they're having conversations about, well, this will be competitive, there's not necessarily agreement. And what's really sad is it can be worse than two. I think it's also, important to think about how the races have become increasingly less competitive. And then also, the Brennan Center for Justice in 2024 looked at competition in House districts. And I think this one is interesting because I've wondered, like, is 23% seems really high compared to like, 9% nationally. Except I think it's important to remember because of term limits, there are many more open races, seats, those elections where both candidates are new on the ballot, and so I suspect that's part of it. And so as we think about these numbers, I think it's worth thinking about, well, what can we do to really improve things? And I was really glad, that Senator Blessing was able to join us to think about, all right, well, what are some options? Especially, I think with the ranked choice voting, I found the restriction of that to be incredibly painful because we really do need to be thinking of doing things in a different way. Also, of course, when I mentioned this earlier, thinking about kind of the connection of primaries and gerrymandering, clearly, when districts are drawn to favor one political party, essentially you can predict who's actually going to win. And if you can predict who's going to win, not only will voters opt out, but good candidates will step aside. And so it is a kind of institutional flaw. And plus other, the advantage of everybody knows your name, and campaign finance, that really impacts who actually goes to DC to represent us and who we send to the state house. And I noticed Denise said ranked choice voting in Ohio is not dead. It is not dead. It's just incredibly painful that our representatives would do what they could to make instituting ranked choice voting so much more challenging.
Yeah.
And with that, I'm handing it to Mia.
I I think this is my slide, but just to sum up, so the three challenges we are facing with primaries, low turnout, high partisanship, fewer competitive elections. So, you know, it's so important that we make a change here because otherwise, this is a fundamental flaw in our democracy that the primaries are not really democratic and they're where all the decisions are happening. So we need to increase civic knowledge. We need to connect voters with their power, increase turnout, widen the electorate. Um, and of course, this is a great year to do it because there is so much happening this year. It's a midterm election. And, It's often considered a referendum on the presidency, and there's often the president who has control of Congress might lose it if they're not very popular. And we have so many races. So we have a Senate seat in Ohio. We have all of the U.S. House seats, all of the statewide elections. We have two Ohio Supreme Court seats, 17 Ohio Senate seats, 99 Ohio House seats, and of course, all the things happening at county and local levels, including issues, levies, and bonds, incredibly important. And this goes back to Elizabeth.
Yeah. So something else that voters need to know, why does any of this matter? So voters need to hear that when more people participate, candidates that we end up with are more likely to reflect what the general public really wants. So one of the jobs of a primary is to send a clear signal about what voters care about. And a higher turnout means that a broader, more representative mix of voices is heard. Candidates who win primaries, and actually those who are already in office, pay attention to those signals. They often adjust their priorities based on what they see voters are responding to. And more candidates that people really like equals more participation and stronger democracy. So when voters feel represented, they are more likely to stay engaged in future elections. And as Catherine was saying, as we've been talking about, in districts where one party dominates, the primary is often where the winner is decided. The primary is the real race here, and whoever wins that party's primary is very likely to go on and win the office in the general election. The die is cast before most voters are even thinking about the election, and so by November, the outcome is already predictable. And so that means that a very small group of primary voters can end up making the key decisions. And participating in a primary is often the only chance to influence who represents you. We had that 1 in 5 number earlier. 20% of Ohio voters are making decisions for 100% of Ohio voters. That is nightmare fuel to me, but as a voter, it's also an opportunity. Your vote is more heavily weighted. And we go to the next slide. So we mentioned this at the top, but one of the biggest things keeping Ohioans from participating in primaries is eligible voters thinking that they cannot vote. And this is just super, super important. If you remember nothing else from tonight, I mean, I really hope that you remember more than one thing, but this one thing is really big. First, voters do not have to pre-register with a political party. You can be unaffiliated, you can be registered with a party that you don't want to belong to anymore, be registered with one party and vote for candidates from another party. None of that matters in Ohio primaries. You can also be a 17-year-old who has registered to vote and will be 18 by election day and vote. 17-year-olds can vote in any race where a candidate that will move on to the general election will be. So they just can't vote for central committee candidates or issues like school levies. And we can go to the next slide. So did I mention this is really, really important? So we are saying it again. Independent voters can vote for candidates in any party. So independent voters, in Ohio, we refer to them as unaffiliated voters. They are just like any other voter in a primary. They too will have to choose a partisan ballot and then vote for candidates on that ballot. And just a quick note on unaffiliated versus independent. Lots of voters who don't belong to or identify with a political party refer to themselves as independent, which is totes fine. You'll often hear unaffiliated and independent used interchangeably, but just know that independent is not a party. It is a vibe. It is a state of mind. In Ohio, again, we call voters that haven't registered with a political party, and we'll get to what that means in a second, unaffiliated. So what if the voter wants to stay unaffiliated? So we strongly encourage every voter to use their voting power. Not voting lets other people make the decision for us. So we recommend that all voters look at the candidates, the humans, the people and their policies, before voting to see who they share values and priorities with. This is, this can be individual to a candidate and or a community and be very different from a party's platforms. And for unaffiliated voters who really, 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 really don't want to vote a partisan ballot, they can and should still vote a nonpartisan ballot. Let me go to the next one. And that is me.
I think this is me. I think you guys are probably all up on this. When you go to vote, you are actually asking for the particular ballot, Democratic, Republican, or Libertarian. Um, and even on an absentee ballot application, you're going to indicate that. Um, and there is also a nonpartisan ballot. You can, I think we've discussed this already. You can have an issues ballot, which doesn't actually have you vote on any partisan party candidates. So it would have state issues, local issues, etc. This is really important, and we have kind of talked about this already. We don't have party registration. It's really just what ballot you pulled in the primary. It's temporary. You can go back and forth. And there, if you pulled a Democratic ballot, you're considered a Democrat until you pull a different one. And you can do, you can change that as often as you want. And if you don't vote in a primary, then you are considered unaffiliated or independent. Now, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, there is an effort, a bill has been brought up to change that system and to turn Ohio to a closed party system. We strongly believe that the current system is the most beneficial to Ohio voters. The way HB 320 would work is that you'd have to be registered with a party 30 days before a primary, just like voter registration. And so any unaffiliated or independent voters who weren't affiliated with the party would not be able to vote in a primary at all. And for, grandfathering in anyone would be considered the party that they pulled that ballot most recently. That would be your party affiliation until you went and you filled out another form and you checked another box. Again, it would have to be within, before 30 days before an election. You couldn't switch back and forth anymore. Your party affiliation would be public. And of course, it would just exclude so many people. Candidates would have to be officially registered with the party in order to run as a candidate, with that party affiliation. And you'd have to be unaffiliated in order to run as an independent. Some people, some of the reasoning behind wanting HB 320 would be to prevent fraudulent party affiliation shenanigans. We don't feel that is that common. We did have a kind of a kerfuffle about it this year with an individual called Samuel Ronan who wanted to run against Mike Carey in Congressional District 15 in Ohio. And he was sort of accused of being a fraudulent Republican, and he lost his case, and it went up to another court. Then we were supposed to find out that he wanted an injunction so that he could still be on the ballot. But of course, voting has already started, and I don't know if that decision was made about the injunction today or not, but it isn't that common. Sometimes people do try to do things like go vote in a different party's primary in order to, mess that up somehow. It seems like that isn't, it seems like it's the better idea to vote for the person that you really think is a great candidate and not play games that way. But in any case, we strongly believe that keeping an open primary is the one that is most beneficial to Ohio voters. Catherine, I think this is you,
I did
Catherine.
not want to come off mute. Okay, so I think it's really important, and I think talked about chocolate and vanilla, Republican and Democrat, that we get, thinking that, we're basically, a two-party country. But one of the things that could really change things and really shake things up is if we actually had multiple parties. There are some real obstacles to actually, getting to having more parties. And they include kind of the structure of how what we think of as minor parties can actually get on the ballot. And so, first of all, there's a petition process. It's 1% of the gubernatorial or presidential vote, plus 500 signatures in half of the congressional districts. And you might be like, well, wait a second, what if you have 15? If it's 15, it goes to 16, and then it becomes 8. So that's the way to think about that. Then to retain their status for 4 years, they must receive at least 3% of the vote. And there's been this kind of long kind of history of making it more challenging to get on the ballot. And a good example was like in March of 2014, Secretary of State John Husted, now U.S. Senator Husted, removed the Libertarians from the ballot because folks did not fill out their Form 15s. Now, any of you who remembers doing the Citizens Not Politicians, you may be familiar with Form 15s. They're basically forms that if you were paid by someone in any way, you need to actually report it. And in this particular case, the Libertarian Party of Ohio had provided some resources to the volunteers, and so they were paid, leading to them being kicked off the ballot. They went through a whole court process to try to, fight this, but they were not successful. So in 2017, they 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 essentially went through this process where they had not collected enough signatures. They're going through this legal process. And then what happened is that the candidates that were libertarian candidates ran as independents, and they got more than 3% of the vote. But even though they got more than 3% of the vote, the Ohio Supreme Court determined that they didn't actually have ballot access simply by getting more than 3% of the vote. And so that when we think about kind of the challenges that they've gone through, I think, you can just imagine how hard it is for additional political parties to get on. Many of you will remember the Natural Law Party from the early, 2000 era. Um, and the signature challenges are actually very similar to kind of the direct democracy challenges with signature collection that we have as well, in many of the different things that we have promoted. And with that, I'm handing it off to our communications extraordinaire, Elizabeth Warner.
Thank you. So how do we talk about primaries? So we've kind of said a lot of this already, but I think this is the messaging that we have found to be the most effective. You can kind of say exactly what you've heard from us tonight. One, all voters are eligible to vote in Ohio primaries. Like that is truly, truly, I get this question many, many times a day. People don't think that they are allowed to vote. Independents, unaffiliated voters, however they want to refer to themselves, are eligible to vote in Ohio's primaries. You do not have to pick a party ahead of time. Ohioans don't have to be registered with a political party in advance. You can choose your ballot when you vote, not months or years before. Voters can choose what works for them for each election. You can request a party ballot or an issues only ballot if you feel strongly about not having any party in your voting history. And you can tell them that just over 20% of eligible voters choose candidates for everyone else in Ohio's midterms. So a very small share of voters is making big decisions for all of us. 1 in 5 voters is effectively shaping who appears on the November ballot and what the discourse is leading up to that, what the priorities are. This small group of voters influences the issues that rise to the top. And our voting voices are louder in a primary. Sadly, because fewer people are participating, each of our votes carries more weight. And again, more participation breeds more representative outcomes. When more people vote, candidates are more likely to reflect the full community, and that just kind of snowballs and gets better and better. And go to the next slide. And we can talk about why using that power matters. We can remind them that Ohio, and I know y'all know, is a highly gerrymandered state, and that so many big races are decided in the primary. Many districts strongly favor one party, which makes the general election, as we've discussed, less competitive in those areas. So that puts much more weight on the primary election. And this is especially true in U.S. House races and races for the state legislature. And every single one of those seats is up. And many of those are effectively decided early, as Mia was saying. There is just a lot on the line this year in Ohio and nationally. Every single statewide office is on the ballot. And with no incumbents, these races are a little bit more open and competitive than usual. That makes the primary even more important. Voters help decide which candidates and, as importantly, maybe which priorities move forward. And the primaries, again, they shape the choices that voters see in November. The candidates and issues that advance are set here right now in these next 3.5 weeks. And these elections are also a chance for voters to send a message. Primary results tell candidates, they tell elected officials, they tell people in government what voters want and how they feel about current leadership. And then we go to the next one, and we'll just do this quickly. Do's and don'ts when we're talking about primaries. Do talk about all Ohio voters' eligibility in Ohio primaries, and again, emphasize that all Ohio voters can participate, including independents. No party registration is required in advance. Don't shame voters for not voting. Separate from it just not being very nice, it just doesn't work. It's just not an effective strategy. Do promote the extra power that voters have in a primary. Again, fewer voters, each vote carries more weight. Again, do not shame voters for not voting. Do talk about 1/5 of voters choosing candidates for 100% of Ohioans. Again, about 1 in 5 voters is currently choosing candidates for all of us. I think you know what I'm going to say next. Don't shame voters for not voting. Do talk about what's on the ballot. Connect races and issues to voters' daily lives. So when you're talking to somebody and you know them well enough to know what the sort of challenges or joys are in their life, figure out how to make that the governor running or the county commissioner or the state auditor or a local issue that's happening, make that connect to what's important to them. Again, do not shame voters for not voting. And then finally, ask them if they have a voting plan. We know that people are much more likely to vote when it is a tangible, concrete idea that is formed in their mind. So ask, do you know when and where you're running? Do you like to vote by mail? Do you vote early? Do you like to vote on election day? Have you already requested your absentee ballot? Practical questions like that get people thinking, and that really, really helps encourage people to vote. And again, do not shame voters for not voting. And that's it. Okay, so increasing civic knowledge to boost voter turnout on the primaries. It is not the answer to all the things. I am not going to lie to you. I am a deeply earnest person, but I'm not that earnest. Bold new policies and election laws that center voters and funding for formal civic education and redistricting and campaign finance reform and ending poverty, like all of these things would be amazing. But these are things that we can do, like each one of us right now can make a difference in. Voter to voter civic engagement will make everything better than it is, and better is better. Voters cannot claim their power without knowing how or why, and we all have the ability to help do that. So we can connect voters with their power, we can help increase turnout, and we can help widen the electorate.
Wow, we did it. We got to the last slide. It's amazing. It's a miracle. That was a lot of information. We hope you like this idea of ours of bringing in more things that are about democracy in general. and supporting a fair democracy. Next month's huddle is actually going to turn back to ballot initiatives, and we're going to talk about what's happening with the struggle for protecting ballot, the ballot initiative process in a lot of states. I think a lot of you remember August of 2023, there was an attempt to take away to make it essentially impossible for citizens to get issues on the ballot here in Ohio. And that is not something that was dreamed up, just in Ohio. It's something that is a struggle and happening all over the country. There are attacks on the ballot initiative process. And so that is what we are going to look at next month. That is May 13th at 6 p.m. And we really appreciate you being here. We hope you enjoyed hearing about primaries. We hope you have a voting plan. What is your voting plan? You should probably drop that in the chat real quick. We want to make sure that you vote and that you let your friends and neighbors know about voting as well. And with that, anyone have any last words?
I got my absentee ballot today. I have a plan.
All right.
Well, and I have to say, I was just really grateful that Senator Blessing was able to join us. And I appreciate, Jen and Elizabeth making that happen because I think that that makes a difference. It's good to hear, what's happening at the State House and that there are all sorts of interesting ideas being discussed.
Yes, I agree. It's really nice to see somebody who's actually tr thinking about ways that we can improve democracy. So thank you guys so much. We will send a follow-up. We will send a recording and slides and all of the things. And glad to see so many of you with your voting plans. Very exciting.
Love it.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, all.
See you in May.